time for Editor's Choice, and that's when we take a look at news that have defined the headlines in your morning papers. It's one moment that is important for us to introspect sometimes as the media, as we also ventilate some of these issues. So let me bring in our guest for today's discussion. Sabelo Skiti is Senior Investigative Journalist at the Sunday Times. Gaopalelwe Palaetsile is a journalist with Jacaranda FM. Tidi Madia also joins us in just a moment. She's a Senior Politics Reporter at Eyewitness News. To all our guests, thanks very much indeed for your time. It's lovely to have you on Politics Unscripted. And I'm not quite sure where to start, if I'm being frank with you, because there's just so much, I guess, to reflect on, especially considering what people are describing as a weird news week we've had in the past. Sabelo, let me be naughty and start with you and ask you to reflect for us what you make of the Sunday Times front page story. My impression is that most publications have largely two options on a Sunday. Do we hone in on a story that's made headlines in the week gone by, or do we try make news and lead the discussion by going in a different direction? The Sunday Times, in some respect, it appears, has taken the latter.
Yeah. Good afternoon, and good afternoon to all your viewers. It is a bit of a change of beat and a change of tact in terms of focus for the front, because you would know the front page is obviously, the page that is basically the window into the paper. This is what gets, the readers picking up the paper off the shelf. I think for us it was basically because we felt it important, to highlight this issue. Because if you look at access to justice broadly, and you look at delays that one experiences in courts in terms of accessing justice, a lot of it is related to basically the administration. So from how the courtroom works, how, the clerks are stacking up the cases and how the cases are progressing. But what impacts that a lot of the times is the fact that you've got also, laboratories that are not producing, lab results fast enough. If you're a person that is familiar with covering court on Mondays, for instance, you'll know that the infamous walk of shame, the drunk driving, now no longer gets treated seriously because of the overrun in the laboratories. People just get arrested, they're made to sit in court. And then the case basically disappears, So for us, it was part of that broader thing. And I actually, reading that article, for me, the first reflection was a sort of thing that says that at least this time it wasn't because there was no DNA testing kits, because at some point there was a shortage of rape kits in police stations across the country, linked to that, you would find that also they've got no ballistics testing equipment, like police officers in Gauteng, for instance, an urban area, will tell you about using charcoal and ash when they arrive to crime scenes because they don't have fingerprint powder.
Sure.
So these are some of the things that we think are quite important. I mean, if you read that story, it's a story of one teenager whose case has been sitting for longer than 2 years now because, the state has not been able to return those DNA tests. She had been raped over a prolonged period by 3 men that are known to her in her community. And of course, she's one of over 200,000 cases that remain unsolved because, the DNA tests don't come back in time.
Exactly.
So that you can imagine the backlog in the courts. You can imagine the backlog of dockets sitting with police and investigating officers.
In fact, your sentiments there,
right.
Yeah, your sentiments there have preempted what I was going to ask next. I mean, it's been given prominence on a Sunday where we know a lot of people are likely to read it. I wonder whether we think this kind of prominence, though, is enough to get the political will to finally solve these issues. Sabelo is right. I mean, this particular teenager, 14-year-old, who we're told on the Sunday Times has allegedly been raped by 3 neighbors, is one of about 208,000 other people who are yet to have justice because of things like a backlog in DNA test results. Putting it on the front page, does it give you the impression that it's enough to make our politicians care?
I think I'm very actually proud of the Sunday Times for doing this because of the angle as well of gender-based violence, because such stories are often on the back burner and at the back of the story. And it's just for this is a story that happened. It's just for the shock element instead of the details of what's actually going on. And I think we've had a president who for the longest time has been using gender-based violence and saying we will be dealing with gender-based violence cases. We will be solving them. Now the question is, there is a backlog. There is people who have suffered gender-based violence and are expecting their cases to go through, but this is happening. One other thing that I noticed that the Sunday Times did that I really, really enjoyed as a journalist and a gender activist myself was that it brought out what this means for the victim, how the victim is doing, knowing very well that the case is this way. That's setting the agenda. That's telling people these are the things we need to think about when we think of gender-based violence and the backlog in cases. So I really, really enjoyed reading the story and the fact that it's in the front page, because this is news that is supposed to be in the front page and never gets to be.
Well, let's stay with the front page and still, I guess, stick with the themes that you've just ventilated for us. Turn our attention to the Sunday world. There's that story around the Tembisa 10 that might catch a lot of people's attention. And, you know, I want to stay with what you've outlined for us, because there's been criticism against the media around how we have specifically treated the woman at the center of the story, and whether or not her interests have been safeguarded as we try to get to the bottom of what happened. Several media organizations have come out to speak around give details around her medical condition, you know, questions around whether or not Hosiame Sithole was in fact pregnant. It's a move that's garnered criticism. I wonder if you feel that criticism is well placed.
You know, it's a tricky situation, but I must say the questions that are being asked now and the things that are being done now, the test and the checking, those are the things that should have been done in the beginning. Now we're here when this story was presented and this woman was telling her story, because that's how we are perceiving it and that's how it was given to us. That's when that evidence should have come through. Now we are at the stage where this woman's body, a black woman's body, is being put at censor stage, being checked and propped and things, so that government can, one, clear its own name because it's been implicated in alleged wrongdoing, and number two, so that we can know if it's true or not, right? Because what everybody's asking now is, where are the twins? Nobody is asking what effects does this have on the mother, but also the broader sense of what effects are we thinking about what we are doing to this woman's body without her consent? Are we thinking about what that means for women's bodies in general, or do we care? Because as much as we want to know the truth, there's still an argument for the fact that it's her body and it's her choice and she must choose. But at the end of the day, also the truth must be told. Absolutely. But also the journalist who did the story, why didn't that be checked in the beginning? You get what I mean?
I mean, outside of actually trying to determine as a matter of fact what did and didn't happen, there are real questions around whether journalism itself actually happened here. This is the editor's choice part of the program. It's lovely to have you, Ayanda Nyathi, in for Xolim Gambi, and continue our discussion with our guests today as we continue unpacking the headlines in the Sunday papers today. I'm joined by Sabelo Suketi, who is a senior investigative journalist with the Sunday Times, Haopalelwe Palezile, who's a journalist with Jacaranda FM, and Tsidi Madia, senior politics reporter at Eyewitness News. And Tsidi, just before we had to take that short breather, we were still ventilating what the Tembisa 10 story has actually meant, not only for Hosiame Sithole, but also for journalism in our country. Eyewitness News is that publication that did release details around Sithole's medical condition, for lack of a better term. It's also been centralized in some respects once we consider whether or not that is in the best interest of Sithole herself. Today, we're being told in the Sunday World that government is under pressure to make some kind of announcement about what happens next. Should that be where the story ends, though?
I don't think so. Good afternoon, everyone. I don't think so. I think it's such a complex, I think how Paleli said, it's a complex story. It is very complicated. It's complicated because of the lengths everyone's gone to either prove it right or to prove it wrong. You speak about what Eyewitness News did last week. Our media house was strongly lambasted, with some people saying it's a question of what's in the public interest versus what's of interest to the public that we needed to debate. And I think our editor-in-chief, Mahlase, spoke by and large how we needed to, at some point in the story that was evolving fake news, you need to get to the heart of it, and that they considered what is possible versus what isn't. Should that be where the story ends? I don't think so. And I think there's multiple fronts that this issue needs to be further ventilated. I think that it speaks of introspection more than anything else about the industry. We ourselves as journalists say there are issues in our industry, and maybe this is part and parcel of what needs to happen, because what a story like this does is it dents media credibility. Already that's a very fragile commodity in a highly politicized, fractured country environment worldwide, actually. So what that story does, it further ruins the relationship between journalists and the public. So there is that. The difficulty, some may say that the publication doesn't belong to the press council. There's got to be other ways around it. I often say that there is an issue around that publication and the rest of the editors. I think the acrimonious relationship, personal bites, should not have a place in what our job is as far as society is concerned. So I think that in and of itself has to be looked at. We've got a lot of reflection to do. And it can't end there for the journalist either. I want to make an argument that Peter Mpedi is probably one of the best we have. You can make your arguments. He's a difficult character, but also he's delivered some great work in his history as a journalist. And I think that he also has a lot of reflection to do. But it can't just stop at, oops, sorry, we're wrong. I think that more needs to be done. It worries you that there was attempts to regulate the press in this country, and whether or not this brings that back onto the table, actions such as these. I don't think you can just stop at, oh, well, he says, she says, and nobody else says anything else about the story. It didn't make sense from the time it came out. There were just way too many questions.
And it appears the questions continue. Sabelo, let me get you an opportunity to have a bite at this. We have also learned that apparently Peter Mpedi, who authored the story initially, or broke the story, I should say, has now been on Power FM, where apparently he said, amongst other things, that he's yet to now verify how many babies they were, let alone the fact that the babies exist. Your take?
Yeah, and I mean, for me, it's basically, it's a bit too late, isn't it? If you're going to put out a headline that says 10 kids, 3 weeks down the line, you're now saying that you're unsure whether there's 10 kids or not, is something that's quite embarrassing, I think, not only for the publication, for the industry as a whole. I fully agree with Tidi and what she says about credibility, especially in a time where it is so easy to generate fake news. There are supposed to be markers that sort of tell you the difference between a genuine news story and what is clearly someone's figment of the imagination. And right now, what the Pretoria News did is basically tell society that actually there's no line between what we in the profession do and what anyone else armed with a laptop and Microsoft Word basically would basically be doing on a blog or on Twitter or whatever. But I think I'd like to sort of touch on a couple of things. I mean, first of all, for me, the EWN story that ran on Friday, I'm still struggling to sort of understand why people took particular issue with that particular article. For me, the thing was that the story should have never then digressed to focus on the woman, because for me, the story was about journalism lapses in the process of journalism. How many people saw that story? When I read it, the first thing I thought was, like, if I was news editor at that publication, that story would have never gone beyond me. I would have not even, asked the journalist question. I would have said, let's sit on the side, let's have a discussion. What do you understand about the story? How do you understand what you understand? For me, it was actually quite shocking that it went throughout the entire process, from news editing to subbing, to even the person who's a proofreader, to see a story that makes a very bold claim on top, but does nothing to substantiate that throughout the article. That should have sent red flags throughout the organization, even before the thing went to print. So when I go back to the mother, for me, I think us as the press then went to a place where we wanted to say, who's the bad guy here? Is she the bad guy? Did she lie? We tried to find out her domestic situation, her personal situation, which really for me has no bearing, because the crux of the matter, as I repeat again, is bad journalism. People come to us with problematic stories on a daily basis. and we don't go back and research who they are, what's going on with them. At the time that Friday comes and EWN sort of runs that very short sort of update, now it's necessary for us to actually establish, because we don't know where these kids were birthed. We don't know how many kids were birthed. So it matters. It's in the public interest when government or a source inside government, and it's corroborated, can basically say that this person bears no physical sort of, she shows no indications that she actually underwent a birth and she birthed, babies. So in that sense, it was absolutely necessary. And I seriously don't think that, they actually went to the extent of sharing any sort of confidential medical information. If you really think about it, the article just basically said that tests have shown that she hasn't given birth. She hasn't undergone a cesarean, operation. So for me, that was the issue. The issue really started when and again, it's the Pretoria News that led us there, by the way. When we started now looking at the mother and saying, did the mother do this? Did she mislead them? When the real question was, did the journalist do proper journalism? Right. There's a template. Right. And I always say this thing when we talk about training of journalists, is that before you are considered even a mid-level journalist, you should have at least covered one press conference where you are dealing with statistics, whether it's crime stats or it's car accidents over Easter. You should have at least covered a couple of court cases. You should have at least done the graveyard shift where you're looking for Christmas or New Year's births. Now, when you do that, you know what the template is. You know what the minimum information is for you to determine whether a birth story is a story or not.
Right.
You know what questions to ask. Yeah. So for me, it sort of raises those sort of issues.
Absolutely. Point well made. Like I mentioned, what the Sunday World is telling us today is that government is set to make some kind of announcement in the coming week. I guess that will help us get a better sense of what ought to happen after that. But let me stay with that publication very quickly. Big week ahead for Ace Magashule Tshilima in the week to come. We're told today that he is likely to now face some kind of disciplinary charges within the ANC, charges for provoking divisions within the ruling party. You have given us at some stage blow-by-blow updates of what the man was saying to you personally. I wonder if he's had anything to say since.
We haven't spoken in a while, the ANC's suspended secretary and myself. It's going to be a big week. I think both sides, Ace Magashule and the ANC, can't necessarily afford to lose out when they go head-to-head in court. But what I also think will be interesting with this application of his that's being heard on Thursday and Friday is that, Ayanda, we're going to hear what happens in the NEC. This is the most sacrosanct structure of the governing party. We hear that there are endless factional battles. You were speaking about the Sunday Times front page and how there are these lapses in basic things. And those things don't get attended to because the governing party is too busy fighting one another to deal with things of governance. And so I think that that's what we're going to hear, how here's a party meant to be in charge of the country that is so preoccupied with fights. This is one of the arguments that Ace Magashule has put on the table regarding the courts about the disciplinary charges that he might face specifically. They had appointed a presenter after he was in Pietermaritzburg, following former President Jacob Zuma's appearance in court. They did say they'd look into whether or not there should be charges of misconduct. We do know that there's some, again, factions. We do know that there's some who desperately want to see Ace Magashule out the door. I know from his camp, he knows that's where he's headed. It's just not going to be an easy walk to the door for the party, not on his part.
Absolutely. We also know that part of what needs to be ventilated by the NEC are guidelines for the selection of candidates, and that's in the lead up to the local government elections. I wonder how they play that card in order to try, I guess, give off a semblance that the cracks aren't going to lead to the complete collapse of the organization itself. Haupalelo, I'll get your take on that when we come back. Stay with us. Welcome back. You're live on Newzroom Afrika, channel 405. This is Politics Unscripted. Ayanda Nyathi here, in for Xolim Gambi. And we continue ventilating some of the news making headlines in your Sunday media. For that discussion, we have Sabelo Sketi, senior investigative journalist with the Sunday Times, Kgaopaleli Paleitsile, who's a journalist with the Jacaranda FM, as well as Tidi Madia, senior politics reporter at Eyewitness News. We're trying to make sense of what the week ahead looks like for Ace Magashule. And Kgaopaleli, let me bring you in. Amongst, call it the Ace problem, dare I say, the ANC also needs to play its cards quite intelligently around the selection of candidates for the local government elections in the week gone by. Let me get your take on how best they navigate both these issues, given what's at stake.
Yeah, I think it's going to be quite difficult, as TD was saying, because of these factional battles. Remember, what the ANC has basically done, it has stopped Ace Magashule from being able to do any party campaign, and that's what he's fighting for. So you have now people who support him having to also be part of this process heading up to the elections. And then at the same time, you still have the people of South Africa having to choose who to vote for when the time comes. And it's a very difficult time because at the same, so you have South Africans sitting here looking at the ANC infighting, and I don't think it's going to get easier. I just think it's just going to get worse throughout the elections. Already we are seeing things in the media coming up. So it's going to be a difficult one because the party still has to also show that it has integrity. It's been talking about unity, and we've just seen that is basically fragmented at this stage. I doubt there's any South African who still believes today that the ANC is united because of this court process that's coming up this weekend.
Absolutely.
This week, I mean.
What I find to be very interesting, and I'm sorry to go back to the Sunday Times, is that opinion piece by Sthebiso Msomi. It's on page 16. He essentially speaks around what we should make of former President Thabo Mbeki sort of entering the fray and having a whole lot more of a prominence, if you like, in public discourse. Part of what Sthebiso is saying is that it's a bit of a pity that Thabo Mbeki had to come from the wings, if you like, to speak about some of the issues within the organization, because it exposes a dearth of leadership amongst the current leaders in the party in and of itself. That was a grand paraphrasing, but I think the sentiment hopefully makes sense and sticks. Does he have a point? How?
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh. I agree. I think he does have a point, but I think I agree that he does have a point. The former president has made some comments in the past, and I think coming out now does show a bit of like, you know, this party, the leadership, are they strong enough as they say? And when you have former presidents like Thabo Mbeki weighing in, which is something he has done before, even at memorial services, speaking about the infighting in the ANC. So I agree that he does definitely have a point.
Sabelo, I have to give you a take on this.
No, I was gonna say, I find it particularly interesting that, you know, these attempts to sort of like woo him are coming from the Eastern Cape. You know, a party that was basically the first one to sort of break out and speak out against the likes of Ace Magashule in the ANC, you know, after the Nasrec conference. So, and I think I agree with what Sthebiso says, and you're paraphrasing, by the way, that it definitely does speak to a recognition amongst some in the ANC that we no longer, number one, have leaders that generally broadly in society are respected, and we need an elder who is going to, you know, step up and sort of talk about the principles that, you know, we hold dear as an organization. Although how we act, I mean, you would remember those short snippets we've seen of NEC meetings, that how we act is not necessarily always in line with that spirit and the sanctity with which, you know, they hold the organization. So for me, it really is a reflection on a dearth of leadership, in a manner of speaking, within the ANC itself. And also a recognition, I think, of just how, you know, off the rails the organization had gone. I mean, the same thing that happened this week, you would have seen in other headlines, was that there was once again violence in PGMs, where they were now electing people that are going to run for councils. You know, people got hurt, they fought over these things. So that's the ANC that we see on a daily basis. Now they need people that are going to come out and speak about, the grand vision, try and convince the electorate, and I think try and convince the membership as well that we need to come back to this center, that holds, things like the Freedom Charter, our own constitution, for instance, and the history of the movement in the country.
Right. Since we're speaking about leadership within the ANC, of course, part of this segment in the program is not only speaking to the stories, but also how we cover them as well. I had the opportunity to speak to Mzwanele Manyi just a few hours ago. Part of the long list of things we ventilated was how the media has treated former President Jacob Zuma. We know that Mzwanele Manyi himself is now a spokesperson for the former president. Let me take you back to that moment before getting your take on what we should make of what he has to say. Take a listen to this.
Right now, what has been submitted in the affidavit, which is public information, is already there. Already some very interesting stuff is in there, and I want the public to go and read it for themselves. And you as media, you have a duty to go there and look at those papers. Right now, all you've been doing, you've been focusing on the case that the NPA thinks it has against President Zuma. But you as the media have not been forthcoming about what Zuma is saying about from his own side of the things. And I'm appealing to you to be fair. I'm appealing to you to be a media that is objective. I'm appealing to you to go pound for pound when you deal with these matters. Do represent the case of the NPA, but also do represent President Zuma's response to these things so that the public is informed. Yeah. What is happening now is a lopsided thing. President Zuma is here to get me to come and say his part because you as the media have been doing everything you can to suppress his viewpoints.
All right, so there you have it, Mzwanele Manyi, the new spokesperson for former President Jacob Zuma. TD, my dear, are we being unfair with how we've treated specifically perhaps the former president and the issues around his corruption trial?
I don't think we're being unfair in how we've treated former President Jacob Zuma at all. If you're going to be a leader who has a view, who has thoughts, who thinks people don't understand a particular issue around you, at least have the mouthpiece. Don't go into a retreat and expect people to come and then make suggestions and think for you. I think part of the difficulty the media has always had when it comes to former President Jacob Zuma, even while he was in office, mind you, is that communications, you hit a wall quite often. If you're not willing to engage people on what your issue is, never mind the corruption trial, then people can only take what they have at their fingertips, what they can access. It's been a very difficult one. Funny enough, I actually spoke to Mzwanele Manyi last week, and he said he has to put his side out in the public. And I said, on a lot of issues, you're taken to releasing those really long statements via his daughter on Twitter. We appreciate that, but you also want to be able to pick up the phone and speak to somebody who's a mouthpiece, a representative of his in that regard to deal with to ventilate particular issues. As far as the corruption trial, that kind of argument is not unique to former President Jacob Zuma to say, oh, you're not representing my side of the story. If you listen to, again, in Battles, the ANC Secretary General, he makes a very similar argument as he says the charges are flimsy. But also our job is to sit and to look at the charges. You say, oh, I'm only charged for oversight. That's not what the charge sheet says. That's not what we're dealing with. I think there is people will push and pull and try and change the narrative. That's their job. And I always say to at least colleagues in the industries or at least spokespeople rather, that we have very different roles. I'm trying to get information from you. You're trying to navigate how I do it and to push and to pull and to protect your organization. I respect that, respect my part, where I also need to find the information and dissect it whichever way I see fit. I don't think the media has been unfair to former President Jacob Zuma at all, and I absolutely disagree with that view.
All right, let's change tack for a while, if we can. I imagine we might find ourselves right back here, but let's reflect on the City Press today and the story that they're running with. It certainly caught me by surprise, only because I think it was just some time last month I'd actually asked questions about what we know about the Bushiris and where they are and how they actually left the country. It has nothing to do with the fact that an interview I had was turned into a meme on social media, but I think it's a legitimate question. Today, we're being told that not only do we not know how they left, it looks like they were able to come back into the country several times. And even then, we're not quite sure how that happened. How, let me bring you in. What do we make of this?
Yeah. You know, when I saw the story throughout the week, I was like, is it possible? Could it be? Because I'm thinking where his position is at the moment and the cloud he left the country, both him and his wife, I don't know if they would come back, but if there is proof of that, that is quite shocking. A source of mine from Malawi, I've been covering the extradition case from South Africa, said to me, it's quite impossible because Bushiri believes South Africa will never protect him. Him and his wife believe that they are more prosecuted here, but that could also be a narrative they are pushing to hide what's happening in the background. So for now, Ayanda, I'd say this is quite speculative until we have proper evidence or some kind of clues that he really did pop into the country. Then we will only be speculating. One of the things that I found really interesting in the city press was that one of the sources says he came into the country to check on his lovers.
Yeah.
Really? Would he risk to think to check on a lover? I would have thought he came into the country to check on his businesses. We know that he makes a lot of his money in South Africa. That would make more sense for him to risk it. But for him to come in to check on his lover, that sounds very flimsy to me. I don't know if I am convinced. I think at this stage it's speculation. We will hear more during the week also, I hope.
Yeah. Yeah. In fact, government has released a statement. I mean, they don't explicitly mention the city press, but they, say something along the lines of, we've seen some of the media reports and we will release the information as soon as it's available to us. But I don't know why you're doubting this source, Khao. I mean, love lives here in South Africa, in some respects. But it does point to another important consideration to be made, Sabelo, and that's around how we treat information from sources. To be fair, the city press prominently mentions that it is sources that claim that the fugitive preacher has been sneaking in and out of the country. Does that justify why they'd put that on the front page, though, given that I guess it's a mild admission that they haven't independently themselves been able to confirm this?
Yeah, thanks for that. And I partly agree with you, in the sense that if I would have probably put it on the front page, I would have probably wanted to also tell the reader how he actually, entered the country. Yes, via land, but via land way, just to show that, we did actually at least establish other information other than the incident that is said to have happened in 4 ways. But I think it's very much a story that's in the public interest. I think it's a fantastic break on the Bushiri story. But I just think I would really have wanted, I think for me, for it to sort of get to that level, and also try and get some sort of, corroboration from the guys that were at that complex where he was. Apparently there was a bit of a standoff, although they don't really put it as a standoff there, but police didn't get immediate access to the gate. So, I mean, something like that for me would be quite easy to sort of corroborate and say in the article that, yes, residents here say that they did see a contingent of police vehicles, for instance, that were at that complex. I think for me, and I mean, South Africa being South Africa, it's one of those stories where you can never really dismiss it,
Yeah.
The fact that the man, as high profile as he is, was able to siphon off, expensive cars and then also leave, tells me that he could very well come back and leave again, without us being the wiser. And I think for me, the state of law enforcement, if it is true that the guy literally got into an Uber and left, I think it shocks me as a South African to know that, specialized police would allow an Uber to just leave with the person that they are trying to they've cornered in a complex.
Yeah. I think that was my favorite part of the story. They called 2 Ubers, we're told. One successfully left and gave the all clear to the other that you can just actually drive through because apparently the cars weren't being checked. But very quickly, with the time we have left, another story which I think is pretty important, especially once we start thinking about some of the reports that came last week to do with the NPA, is on page 2 of the City Press. Brian Hlongwa, we're told in some respects that the walls are closing in on him. He's faced allegations of corruption that date back to about a decade or so. This is an important story in the light of last week's reports around how the NPA boss, Shamila Batoor, is I guess, if you like, cracking the whip on inaction that had taken place when it comes to following through on some of these prosecutorial cases, for lack of a better term. Sabelo, I mean, are you reading into that the same thing, or does something else stand out for you?
Actually, Ayanda, that for me was front page. You know, the level of detail in that article, you know, about the progress of the investigations, you know, the emails that have been quoted, sort of saying that we need to try and retrieve the gentleman that's in Mozambique. That for me is compelling reading, you know, especially if you understand the sort of Brian Hlongwa case, its links to state capture via regiments. And I think definitely it is one of those moves that I think for the NPA bolsters public perceptions around, you know, a fight against corruption. Because I think one of the things that, you know, we are quickly becoming accustomed to is that whether it's the old administration or the new administration, there definitely is no political will to move on corruption. And I think it makes the right signals for me, for you to have this great development come through. And I mean, it's also not missing who Brian Hlongwa is in the context of Gauteng politics. I'm sure Tsidili would agree with me here that he's not a nobody, you know. Yes, he's a former MEC, but he's quite an important player in Gauteng politics on its own.
I see them nodding. I think that means they agree with you. Sadly, I can't get their take because we're out of time. I have to thank you for all your takes. I could have this discussion until the cows come home, but thanks very much indeed. Sabelo Skiti is a senior investigative journalist with the Sunday Times. Kgaopalele Paletsile is a journalist with Jacaranda FM. Tidi Madia, senior politics reporter at Eyewitness News.